So I'm really, again, thrilled to have Michelle Rogers and Jeff Forbes here joining us from the National Science Foundation. And I'll hand it off first to Michelle Rogers, who's a program director at the NSF, focused on this broadening participation in computing initiative. Michelle?
Okay. Thanks, Colleen. So Michelle Rogers, I'm here new to the NSF. I've been here for about a month and a couple of days, actually. So it's great to be here. Came from Drexel University in the College of Computing and Informatics. So kind of cuts across a lot of what some of you may have come out of. And so we're excited to be here to answer your questions.
I'm Jeff Forbes. Thank you, Colleen, for organizing this workshop, and thank you, Michelle, for the intro. I'm also a program officer at NSF. I've been working on this BPC Pilot, and just wanted to go over some of the overall motivation for the pilot and some of the details I think that might help you as you're considering this. So first important part, Michelle, we need to update this picture because
yes.
Unfortunately, since Michelle has been here, we haven't actually been at NSF, but it's important to note that this, what we do here, the education and workforce cluster, where Michelle and I work, our job is to lead this pilot, but this really goes across the directorate.
Yeah.
Right? This is something that the whole directorate's involved with, which has a lot of input and support from the leadership. So we really thank all of our colleagues across the directorate who are working on this, but in particular want to thank our colleagues in the education and workforce cluster who actually help us go through all of these BPC plans and do all the reviews and do all the monitoring. So if we go to the next slide. So back in 2012, the CISE Advisory Committee was really looking at some of the long-standing issues in computing, in particular the long-standing issues of underrepresentation, and really noted that it wasn't just that we were thinking about what we can do in the K-12 space, what we can do in the undergrad space, what we can do in the grad space, but noting that if we want to address these computing specific issues of underrepresentation of many groups, that it's going to take the committed, focus, and sustained effort on the part of many, or really all of our computing community. So the way that we proposed to do this back in 2012 was by making sure that rather than BPC just being this little slice of what we do, where like the education and workforce cluster would give out awards, instead, let's have the inclusion of BPC efforts as an accepted and expected part of the research award portfolios. So what that means is, as you're going to do research in CISE, that we expect that there's going to be some kind of meaningful effort for broadening participation in computing. And how do we do that? Well, one, we start with requirements. So we require meaningful BPC activity in what is an expanding set of CISE programs, but we understand that we can't just make a requirement, we have to provide some support. And so we're providing resources and support for both the PIs and the reviewers. And a lot of what's happening here in this workshop is about that. And finally, we need to see how we're doing. This is a pilot, and we also need to provide support through reviews on all the BPC plans that are submitted, and that we also require reporting of the outcomes in the annual reports for awarded projects that have BPC plans. So go next. So the vision that we have is that we'd like to see BPC that's embedded within and across the CISE research community, so that CISE research proposals include a meaningful plan to broaden participation in computing. And we're going to come back to what meaningful means and try to define that better. But the general idea is that over time, we have this staged development model, right, where quality of plans are going to improve. And so then as it becomes more and more just a standard part of what we do, the amount of reviewer feedback that we need is going to decline. And then as plans are implemented, we are going to share the lessons learned, right? This is not that if you do something at your institution that helps someone else, that's something for everyone to learn about. And we have an internal working group that's monitoring and supporting the progress of BPC. And then we also expect that through this work, that you're going to see collaborations between CISE researchers and other PIs that have particular broadening participation expertise are going to increase. And that we should be on our way towards making measurable progress towards diversifying the CISE research community. That's a long-term goal, but that's where our long-term goal is. And we can do that across many different kinds of activities. So let's talk about some examples of those activities. So an activity that many people will immediately think of when they think of BPC is, well, what can I do in terms of the research that I'm already proposing? So if I have some technical research proposed on machine learning algorithms, what can I do with those research activities going to broaden participation in computing? And you can do something like that. That's not your only opportunity. But an example of how you might do something like that and do it in a meaningful way that's going to broaden participation in computing is by partnering. So for example, CRA's Committee on Widening Participation has the DREW program. That's Distributed Research Experiences for Undergrads, where you have undergrads from institutions across the country can come to different institutions, so including your lab. So you can host 2 students. CRA also partners with Access Computing and IMCS, 2 other broadening participation in computing alliances that focus on students with disabilities and African-American students respectively. So the thing about DREW is you're getting a program that has, it's going to help you recruit and also be able to assess and monitor the progress of what you're doing with your RU experience. So that's a research activity. Another thing you might consider is an outreach activity. So a lot of PIs will say, well, I'm going to go into the community. I'm going to do something with local girls, for example. If you want to do something with local girls, you know, at middle school age, then you should do that through an existing program. We really encourage you to do that through an existing program. So for example, you might want to do that through the Girl Scouts. Girl Scouts have 2.5 million members. They're everywhere in the United States. So you can volunteer to teach computer science in a Girl Scout troop. But I also want you to consider the other 2 quadrants as well, right? Consider things that are closer to your control and to what you do every day. So for example, if you're faculty, you can imagine doing some faculty development. So what counts as BPC? Well, just learning about BPC and learning about how you can use this to improve your courses, improve what you're doing in your department, that's also a possibility. So NCWIT, National Center for Women in Information Technology, is NCWIT 101, and you can click on all these links that are in the slides, and you can learn about BPC. Another thing you can do is you can also think about what you do as a department. How do you make your department more inclusive? One of the things you could imagine is just collecting data, that's BPC. So Commandit has an award for having the best retention of various groups. And you will learn, I imagine, quite a bit about your department if you look at from first year to second year to third year to fourth year to graduation. Like, how are you doing in terms of retaining students in your program? And merely deciding to do the work to gather this retention data, and they give you the information you need to go to your institutional research office and be able to gather this data. Just merely doing that can be BPC. So you don't have to think about BPC merely being, I'm getting a research student in my lab, or I go out and I preach about the wonderfulness of computer science. There are a lot of ways that you can do BPC that are well within your comfort zone. So one of the things we try to do from NSF's point of view is we want to provide resources to help you with your BPC plans. So one place you can find help is from the BPC alliances. NSF has been funding 8 different BPC alliances that focus on different demographic groups and different points of the academic pathway. So for example, there's CASI, the Computing Alliance of Hispanic Serving Institutions, IMCS, the Institute for African American Mentoring in Computing Sciences, right? So these focus on Hispanic and African American students respectively. In access computing, we talked about focus on students with disabilities. But there's also programs that focus on K-12, like ESEP, Expanding Computing Education Pathways, and Real CS. Or if you want to think about how you can involve your students in service learning, there's the STARS Computing Core. NC-WIT has lots of resources for departments and lots of member departments, and CRA-WP has lots of programs to try to bring students into research. We also fund the CS for All Consortium in some ways, and the CS for All Teachers.org, which connects teachers to community practice for teachers. But the bottom line is we really encourage you in your work to work with resources, whether they're local or national, that have experience engaging in BPC type activities at scale. So we've reviewed a lot of proposals, a lot of BPC plans over the years and talked to a lot of PIs. And one of the things we've learned is that the ideal BPC plan describes an evidence-based, sustained response to a well-articulated aspect of broadening participation. So what we mean by that is you might have a great idea, but you want to say, like, what evidence is it based on? And how are you going to be able to sustain this? And you need some particular aspect of broadening participation. You get to pick what group you focus on. You get to pick what particular problem you need to do. Right? You do not, I showed you those 4 quadrants. You get to pick one small aspect of those 4 quadrants, and you just want to make sure you're making some meaningful plan to that. And but we recognize that many CISE PIs, especially those new to BPC, may not necessarily be in a position to develop or execute such an ideal plan. So we take a stage of development view of what your plan is going to be. So at the beginning, we expect a lot of people are going to be just getting started. We want to move them to evolving, to having impactful plans. So that's where we are right now. So we go to the next. What makes for a meaningful plan? Well, we're judging your plan based off of 5 elements. 1, context. So you need to know your particular institutional and local context. So in what your goals are of your activities. So you might look and notice that, for example, in your program, you're disproportionately losing Hispanic female students going from CS1 to CS2. What can you do about that, right? Or you might just have broader things that you'll notice that, for example, the percentage of women in your program is not as high as the overall institutions. I mean, lots of things you could imagine. So you have the context and you have some particular intended population. And so it's going to specifically identify the demographics of the participants, including the underrepresented group and the school level. On the later slide, I'll explain to you, for the purposes of BPC, what the underrepresented groups are. But you might say African-American undergraduates or female high school students. Again, you get to pick what the intended population is. You do not have, and also you can pick that underrepresented population even if they're not underrepresented at your institution, right? For example, if you're an all-women's college, you can say, we're going to work with female college students, and that counts, right? You do not have to go out and do something different than what your mission is necessarily. And then you have activities, right? You have your strategy, which is a set of activities, and important that they have intended outcomes corresponding to your context and intended population, with a role for each PI and co-PI. That's the key thing, is make sure that every PI and co-PI has some role. They don't have to have a role in everything, but they have some role in something. Then you're going to do these activities. What preparation do you have? Have you done prior work with BPC? Tell us about that and what the outcomes might have been. Or you may have never done this before. That's fine. What's your intended preparation or training activities so that you can implement your proposed work successfully? And finally, you can't really do something if you don't measure at least the outcomes in some way. So you need to have some particular plan for the measurement of the outcomes of your proposed activities. It'd be nice if that plan is not just about counting people. It's not just quantity. We'd like to know something about the quality, but at minimum, we need some kind of measurement. So when, to give you an idea of how we review the proposals, so if you submit for the medium core proposal deadline, which is November 12th, that's coming up real soon, or cyber physical systems or secure and trustworthy cyberspace, right? Then you have to submit then you have to have a meaningful BPC plan at the time of award. So you're going to submit that as a supplementary document in your submission. And there's going to be one plan per project. Our goal has been to educate the CISE community on the elements of the effective BPC plan. That's why we have workshops such as this one, and to provide high quality feedback on submitted BPC plans. So we have rubrics and those 5 elements and lots of information to do that. So the way it works is some BPC experts come in, they review those plans, and then the CISE reviewers use those BPC reviews to inform their discussion. But it's important to note that BPC plan does not affect your rating, like whether you get an excellent or very good or whatever, and it doesn't even affect your award recommendation. But you do need to have a meaningful BPC plan at the time of award. So it's a good thing to have one at the time when you submit the proposal. And you will get those BPC expert reviews and any comments that the core CISE reviewers make too. Okay. Go to the next slide. So some places to find information. So one of the first places you should go if you're submitting to CISE core program, for example, is you look at the CISE core program solicitation, which lays out those 5 elements. So you know that those are the things we're going to be looking at. And also there's a BPC fact, which addresses a lot of frequently asked questions about what that people have raised about the BPC pilot and the BPC requirement. So a couple things that come up a lot. So for the purposes of the BPC pilot and your BPC plan, so we strongly encourage meaningful actions that address long-term underrepresentation of various populations that we've specifically listed here. These are populations for which we have some data on long-standing underrepresentation and computing-specific underrepresentation. So women, African Americans, Hispanics, American Indians, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, Native Pacific Islanders, and persons with disabilities in computing. Right. So those are our underrepresented groups. You are able to address other groups too, right? You can say we're going to focus on women and veterans, or women and low-income students. There also happens to be often a lot of intersection between some group that you pick and some of these. But it is important to note this is over 70% of the population, so we're at least trying to address a substantial portion. Okay, so another common question is about broader impacts versus BPC. NSF has had a broader impacts requirement for quite some time now. I meant to look this up, but long time. Certainly much longer than I've been a professor, and that's been over 20 years. And that covers an array of activities that impact society that may or may not include broadening participation. So broadening participation is a subset of broader impacts, but there are lots of broader impacts things you can do. For example, you could say, with the work that we're going to do, it's going to have a substantial impact on computing technology, and thus a substantial impact on, like, American competitiveness. That counts as a broader impact. That's not broadening participation. Similarly, you might have a project that says we're going to have a math camp over the summer. And that's a great broad impact. You're going to say, this project is all about logic. We're going to have some camp where students get to really delve into that. It's not broadening participation unless there are underrepresented groups involved, right? Unless you're going to specifically address members of underrepresented groups, while broad impacts do not necessarily address those groups. Another question that comes up a lot is, how do I pay for this, or what needs to happen? So first, I'd say many BPC activities don't really cost much. It turns out, like, if you decide to sit down and learn about how to make your classes more inclusive, it doesn't necessarily cost anything specifically. But if there are particular costs, those are separate from the state budget limit for a proposal. So let's say your class proposal has a $1.2 million limit. That means if you're recommended for funding, then you could get more funding on top of that at the time of award negotiation for the BPC activities. So you would submit for review a budget for the cost of any BPC activities with justification. So if there are costs involved, those can be you should not include you do not have to include those as part of your overall budget limit. But do not submit a proposal that has that goes over the budget limit at proposal time, because that can get it returned without review. So some common pitfalls of BPC plans. So if you have a plan and it has a set of activities, but then somehow some PIs are not involved with anything. So that's a problem, right? Every PI has to be involved. And that's, again, across institutions, because especially mediums are going to be across institutions quite often. So that's a problem. Another big thing is people will have a list of activities, but no metrics. So you need to have some kind of metrics that you can report on as outcomes. You might have you might decide to do something with your program, but it's good to get demographics of your intended population. One of the things I imagine Colleen will show you is how you can get the demographics for your institution quite easily of the grads of your institution. So in your program, so that's something you can look at. In broadening participation in computing, we do not give extra points for being novel, right? I know we have scientists and everyone wants to do something interesting, and doing new things is nice, but you're more likely to be successful if you can build upon best practices and existing efforts. And that will also make it less of a lift. As I mentioned before, a big problem can be confusing broader impacts and broadening participation. So for example, that if you have that camp, that math camp, that can work if you say, we're going to have a math camp where we're going to have a specific recruitment plan for high school women in the area, and we're going to do certain things that to make sure that the program is successful for them. And then finally, another thing you might do is say, this is BPC because here's a whole bunch of PhD students that I have. I have a whole set of African-American male PhD students. But you might want to say, well, out of how many students? And how does that compare to your overall program? So if you say, look, I have 2 female students, but everyone else but that's like a lower proportion than the rest of your department. I mean, it's not meaning that you don't have nothing, but you need to show something about that. And in particular, it'd be nice to know what the recruiting and mentoring strategies are that you have for those particular students. All right. Now, one of the things we also encourage is we understand that a lot of this is a substantial lift for an individual PI. So we encourage institutional efforts to address BPC. So we encourage units to develop their own departmental plans to which faculty can contribute. So the idea is your department may have a plan, and then you could say, here are the things I'm going to do out of that plan. And this enables sustained cultural change because your department exists over time and assessment of impact. It is completely fine, for example, if you have a department and you have some undergraduate research program that's really, successful and focuses on BPC, and that has some assessment impact. Everyone in your department can plug into that. There's no reason why everyone should make their own necessarily. And back to Colleen.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Jeff and Michelle, for joining us. That was very helpful. Okay, so team, I'm Colleen Lewis. I'm an assistant professor of computer science at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Before that, I was at Harvey Mudd College. And I hope that you're a little bit overwhelmed being like, oh, Jeff, that's a lot of stuff I've got to do. Are there resources available to help me do this well? And my answer is going to be yes. Yes, it is on bpcnet.org. We've got your back. So I want to first talk about that last piece that Jeff talked about of these different documents. So we today are focused on these project or these NSF BPC plans shown on the left-hand side of the slide. These are submitted to the NSF. They're 1 to 3 pages, submitted as supplementary documents, like Jeff said. They describe the roles of each PI. And the goal really is to get each PI to do impactful BPC work. The other piece that we just heard Jeff talk about was this long-term sustained institutionalized piece. So the goal is to have every department create a BPC plan. These are going to be just 2 pages, and they describe and sort of bring together all of the activities within the department to help them get organized. The really nice thing is that, say I've got 10 PIs on my proposal. In 3 pages, that's not going to give me much space to provide my context and in addition, a description of my activities. The reviewers understand that. And the thing you can do is you can link to a department plan within your 3-page project plan. And so those department plans can get submitted to bpcnet.org for verification. I'll make one additional note, which is that many departments find it's helpful to have an internal department. So at UIUC, we have an internal document that's something like 10 pages, because that helps us do a good job of really getting organized about all the BPC work that we have going on, seeing those opportunities for shared measurement, et cetera. And then we can use that as a launching point to help PIs write that project plan. Okay. So that was the piece of clarifying that I wanted to do. Now, next, I'm going to walk you through these 3 important links: how to guide for project plans. Those are the ones you submit to the NSF. There's some free consulting for your BPC plan, and graduation data for your institution. So the key page that you're going to need, and I want you to read every word, if you could, is the bpcnet.org project BPC plan. It's got templates, checklists, examples, and common mistakes. And I'm going to walk you through each piece of that. So let's start with this template. So the NSF solicitation that Jeff showed you is on the right-hand side, and the template that we give you is on the left-hand side, and it's customized to make sure that you check all the boxes of what the NSF is looking for in those pieces. I'll note the template use is not required, and a template can be used once per activity. So say Jeff and I were collaborating and I was going to do 2 activities. I would use the template once for my first activity. I would use the template a second time for my second activity. And then Jeff would use the template once for his activity. Okay, so the template is per activity to make sure that you're providing for every activity the context, population, strategy, preparation, and evaluation. And again, the activities of each PI can be overlapping or disjoint. Jeff and I do not need to pursue the same or address the same problem in terms of BPC. We can have totally different activities that make sense in our context or align with our interests. Here's just a little snapshot of what that template looks like. So we've got LaTeX and Google Docs version so that you can go through and fill out what are the pieces to really be able to make an effective plan. Okay, that was the template. Onto the checklist. So based upon what the NSF says they want, and based upon the community reading tons and tons of these BPC plans, we've created a checklist to identify what are the contents of a good one. So the template can be used once per activity. So if Jeff and I had 3 activities amongst us, we would want to check off everything in the checklist for every activity. And I'll just make one note, the template also includes a copy of that checklist so that you can make sure that if you're just using the template, you've got the checklist things. You know, when you complete this section, you should have met these expectations. Okay, that was our checklist. And you're like, Colleen, I would like to see some examples. Okay, so even better than just examples, we have examples that you can copy and paste into your project. Novelty, as Jeff said, is not important. And these examples use the checklist and have everything that's required on the checklist. So you can see them on that page. These include the examples that were linked from Jeff's slide. So here's a copy of Jeff's slide. So you can click on these and copy and paste them into your plan. There are just notes about, say, the preparation that you need to do before pursuing this, or you might provide, there's some fill in the blanks in these examples. So when you click on one of those, it'll take you to a page on BPCnet, and there's a part of it that says how to use this activity in your plan. And this is the content that you can copy and paste into your plan. And like, it's so counterintuitive when we're thinking about writing a grant, because we're always thinking about transformation, we're always thinking about novelty, but novelty is not a strength when it comes to BPC. We have a good set of resources, and if we can get more people to use those to broaden participation in computing, that can be really powerful. Okay, last piece is these common mistakes. There were some things that we identified which were common mistakes, most of which you heard about from Jeff, that you might not infer that you shouldn't do these things based upon the checklist. And so we've added additionally these common mistakes that help you decide what to do, help you figure out how to describe it, and help you figure out what to do when you're implementing it. Okay, so this page really has a lot of information for you. Okay, next. The NSF has funded the Computing Research Association to offer free consulting for your department plan. For your BPC work. So if you go to bpcnet.org, you can see the consultancy button at the top, and you can select a 30-minute or 60-minute meeting. That allows you, I pulled up Wednesday's schedule, that allows you to select from all of these different options when a BPC expert can meet with you to talk through your specific situation. They can help you with any writing of any of the texts. They can review things for you and help you understand the extent to which you're meeting the items in the checklist. The third piece I want to talk to you about is this graduation data from your institution. So each of our institutions has to report our graduation numbers to the national government. The national government has a program called IPEDS that keeps track of all that data. The IPEDS interface is quite difficult to use, but the folks at bpcnet.org created this portal so that we can go in. Here I entered my state, my institution, bachelor's degrees. I can see what different national course categories are included, and then I can pull all the data from 2011 to 2019, disaggregated by both race and gender. And I can also see how I compare to my state and how I compare to the national averages. And this is so easy and wonderful. It's a new tool that was just released this summer. This can really help us get a good eye on what's happening in our department. And that's just at bpcnet.org/statistics. Okay, Jeff talked about this a bit, but I think a lot of faculty assume that BPC work always involves outreach to K-12 and sending students to diversity-focused conferences. And these are totally reasonable BPC activities. But the question I want you to ask yourself is, do they take advantage of a faculty member's skills and sphere of influence? So it doesn't make sense for you to do K-12 work if you don't have experience working with K-12 students or developing K-12 curriculum. That's not within your skills, your initial skill set, and you can do things that do align with your skill set. Within your sphere of influence, I think about, I'm a faculty member at a university, and faculty members get to shape curriculum, pedagogy, department policies, and so I can engage in BPC work that focuses on things that I uniquely have power over to be more effective. Some great examples of that are changing our pedagogy, how we teach. That's an activity that can affect all students, but there's research that we reference on bpcnet.org for you to explain how all students will benefit from this improved inclusive pedagogy, but students who are underrepresented in computing because of their race or gender are likely to benefit more. And so even though it's an activity that serves all of your students, it still can count as a BPC activity. Similarly, resolving or addressing issues or improving your curriculum, changing department policies like I talked about. Jeff mentioned that just learning about broadening participation in computing can count as a BPC activity. And these first four, I think, are really impactful because they are easily sustained. Once I change the way I teach, I'm going to keep teaching it in that way. And then two more that Jeff mentioned, expanding research opportunities and then monitoring BPC data, similar to the monitoring attrition rates. On bpcnet.org, we have a ton of resources. There's a huge bank of them if you follow resources, customizing your BPC plan. So here we've got selecting resources for selecting BPC activities. So that page is organized into these two big buckets. One is student and faculty retention, and then outreach and recruiting. Again, we might think of outreach and recruiting as our first stop, but I want to push you to think about student and faculty retention, thinking about improving our ecosystem as our first responsibility in terms of BPC. For each one of these things, BPCnet has a curated list of all the resources you need. So here's an example of for expanding research opportunities. And what you can see is I have 4 links that are going to help me do this well. And then I also have the argument for why this is going to be helpful for BPC. Okay, and those are important pieces that you can, again, copy and paste into your plan, is that sort of argument, typically including a research link, and then the specific how-to guides that we think are going to be the most easy for you to sort of pick up and run with. There's also 37 example goals. I think people find these helpful to think about what might they do. And again, these are organized by those same set structure. Okay, so you've got the overview of what exists on BPCnet. The easiest path to an impactful BPC activity is to download data from your context. So that's that statistics page. Copy and paste an example plan like the ones I showed you. You can also see a Google Docs version of all of them at this tiny URL. And then you complete the provided preparation. For example, Jeff mentioned the Girl Scouts. Before you can present a plausible case that you're going to volunteer with the Girl Scouts, you need to have reached out to the Girl Scouts. You need to have completed their required background check. So each of the example activities that you can copy and paste in have descriptions of what you will have done before you submit that plan. None of them are totally overwhelming, I promise. My first question is about scope. How do I decide what's the right scope for my BPC activities?
Scope is like, you need to do something that's meaningful. It doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to change society or even your department, right? Your goal is to find something that is going to be meaningful, right? And where meaningful we've defined as you have some metrics that you can keep track of, you have some group and some goal that you're moving towards. So if you think that by collecting this, by like making this change to the pedagogy, it's going to have that you have evidence that's going to have particular impact on this underrepresented group, that is something, right? And that is something that you can do, you can report on and move on, right? There doesn't have to be, the scope is whatever you determine is appropriate. And also, go ahead.
Maybe folks should talk to their program officer. Is that also?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Yes. For everything, when, in particular, when you're going through award negotiation or thinking about what you should be doing during your project, talking to your program officer is a great idea.
Awesome. You've mentioned that all PIs need to have roles and responsibilities. Do all of the students who are going to be working on the research project, do they need to have roles and responsibilities in the BPC project?
No, that is not required. It might be a good idea, but it is not required.
Should the BPC activities that a project engage with relate to the research that's being conducted? Do you see that as a benefit, and do you see that as a requirement?
It is absolutely not a requirement. Many PIs are clearly comfortable with trying to do things that relate to their the actual research, and some believe that they're more likely to do it if it's in line with the actual research they're doing, but it is not at all a requirement. And in some cases, it may not even be a good idea because it might be difficult to do your cryptography research at the middle school level, right? And you might not get as many takers as you might think.
You mentioned that data collection was an appropriate BPC activity, like collecting retention data. What would you say is the evidence base that I provide in my BPC plan in that case? Because you said I wanted an evidence-based sustained response.
Mm-hmm. So if, for example, what you're doing is you're collecting data for, we talked about the commanded retention program. So you're looking at where you might have some groups with disproportionate number of proportion of the students who are leaving the program. So the evidence base you're going to have there is the data that you're going to collect. Like you might start by saying, here's what the proportions are of our graduates, but you may not necessarily know what that matches your first course. I mean, I'll just say as NSF program officers, we're very wary of when someone says we have this percentage of students in our courses or in our intro versus this percentage of people graduating, right? It's very different saying you have 50% women in your CS1 than it is saying you have 50% women in your undergrad students who graduate. And we also know that master's is very different than PhD and et cetera. So anyway, I think you can gather some data at the beginning that's easy to get from BPCnet. And then as part of your project, try to get data that's a little more difficult to obtain, like retention data.
And I'll make one note, the Commandit Award, you're like, well, we don't know how we're doing with retention. It seems silly to apply for an award. But one thing that is strategic about the Commandit Award is applying for an award might help your institution be committed to providing you the data that you want to be able to monitor attrition. And so the Commandit folks are happy to receive applications that will likely not win awards, but will get you on the path to be collecting the data to be able to make informed changes in your institution. Can I focus on just first generation college students?
So if you just focus on first gen college students, that is not one of the groups that we highlighted, but it has a extremely broad intersection with those groups. So you could do that in addition to one of the specifically called out underrepresented groups, but you shouldn't do that as the only group.
So if I was collecting retention data, I might disaggregate by race, gender, and first generation college status. That would be appropriate.
That would be very appropriate. And it would certainly be appropriate to say, we have a particular issue with first gen African-American students and say, we're going to focus on that. That would be a great idea.
When I apply for a grant, where, say I want $7,000 for each of the DREW students, so that's the undergraduate research students that I'm advising, where do I put the fact that I want $7,000 a year?
So if you just knew you were going to do this as part of your project, you could put it in the regular project budget. But if this is just part of your BPC plan, then what you would do is say in your BPC plan that you're planning to work with the DREW program. And then when you are at award time, you would say, well, I want, this is going to cost this much money. Can we add this? And it would be pretty straightforward to justify adding something for DREW because those costs are pretty well known, et cetera. And also for DREW, that's a case where you could also do an RU supplement, and that's a different pile of money, but that's not.
And there's also a spot in the template to identify the budget for each of the activities in case you're using the template. Okay, with NSF grants, they're always focused on novelty. So, can you reassure me that copying and pasting a BPC activity won't be seen as not novel, and so then I won't get funding for my grant?
Okay, so first, your BPC plan does not impact should not impact your rating or award recommendation. So whether you get funding or not, that's like whatever you say in your BPC plan shouldn't have any impact on that. Or even if you didn't have a BPC plan at all. We give the same guidance that we're giving to you to reviewers, the BPC reviewers. the reviewers use their own judgment in terms of assessing BPC plans, but that's just advisory. So I would expect that BPC reviewers would not focus on novelty, but reviewers. I don't want to say that a reviewer might not say, sometimes reviewers have concerns that, show me what you're doing new beyond like what's just standard practice. So that comes up in particular, for example, if you say, I've had a bunch of female graduate students, I'm going to have more. And you never specify at all, like, have you done anything particularly good for them or et cetera? So that might come up. But yeah, sorry. Michelle, you can chime in on that, but I don't know if I have a great answer to assuring you that novelty is not important.
I think there's a difference between novelty and being intentional about what it is that you propose. So if you copy and paste and don't pay attention to the nuances that are specific to your institution, then that might lead more toward not getting the best response. Can I say it that way? Yeah.
Yeah, and with the, because we know people might be copying and pasting these example activities, in that preparation section, we tried to help you be able to demonstrate commitment. So for example, one of the example activities was adopting an inclusive pedagogy strategy. This is how you teach, called Pure Instruction, where people use clickers and interactivity. And one of the things that you would do before submitting that is identify on pureinstruction4cs.org what course materials are you going to base your course materials on, so that you've gone and looked to see that those available resources are appropriate for your context, etc. Okay, we've got a question. Do we need to provide citation if we copied a BPC plan? Any issue in plagiarism if copy and paste is used? This is a good question.
This is a good question. So certainly, it's hard to imagine how if you copy out of a department plan, that would be a problem. I don't think so, but I have to be a little careful with making statements about plagiarism because that's a policy and, could go to the inspector general and things of that sort. So I don't want to, like, if you copy for someone without their knowledge and then they reviewed your proposal and they complained, what would happen?
But I think here we're talking about specifically the 6 example plans that are posted on BPC Net that say, copy and paste these in. I think you could add a note saying adapted from BPC Net because there'll be pieces where you need to fill in some blanks. But I think
it is expected that people will cut and paste plans. I just want to, like, that is, I would say, a goal. Yeah, you're still subject to broader rules. So, but yeah, if you copied from BPC Net, that's what it's there for.
Jeff and Michelle, why should my department create a department plan? I know that I need one as a PI because I'm submitting to core, SATSE, or a CPS medium, but why do I want a 2-page department plan?
I think you want one because it will make the PIs in your department make their jobs easier, right? That all they then need to do is take that 2-page plan and insert it in, and then talk about how they're going to contribute to that plan, and then they're done. Then it also is a way to take the existing, efforts that you're doing in terms of diversity and inclusion and sort of bring them together, right? And so that you have everyone going in the same direction, right? So that rather than having a lot of people doing a whole lot of things, now you have because what the department plan is, it establishes some goals, and now you're having all these different projects contribute to them. So at least the 2 big things I think of immediately are just makes everybody's lives easier and provides a way to get everyone going in the same direction. Michelle, what do you think?
I think it also, if we are truly about, as you mentioned in the slides earlier, like this is something that we all have to do. So if it constantly comes just from one PI, and we point to, oh, that's the person that's doing broadening participation, then we've missed our mark, right? So if our goal is to get everyone to be involved, then we need to get everyone to be involved, and that hopefully your department would want to support you and support the department and ultimately the university in broadening participation.
Awesome. Well, Jeff and Michelle, thank you so much for joining us today. This was rich, and I'm glad we got to hear from you and your perspectives about the NSF requirements. We're excited as a community that the NSF is leading this charge. It's really important work. It's going to take all of us to do it, but we've got good resources there. Novelty is not necessary. We just all need to be working on this together. Any last thoughts, Michelle or Jeff?
Just thank you, all of you, for all the work you're doing on this. I mean, it is each one of these efforts towards each one of these plans is actually, I think, really going to help us as a community. So thank you. And thanks to Colleen for putting so much of these materials together. I think we're in a much better place than last year.
Yeah. Awesome. Let's do some good BPC work, folks. Thank you so much for coming. And